In today's video, we'll be looking at the last of the Royal Navy's heavy cruisers, a ship that endured nearly until the 1960s, long after most of her sister ships had been scrapped, or sunk in combat for that matter. This ship, HMS Cumberland, can be seen as fortunate in that regard. She evaded the worst fighting and as a result survived. And when her conflict came to an end, Cumberland continued on as a trial ship, letting her evade the scrapyard for a time. Ships like this can be interesting in their own right for how long they endured, although Cumberland has another distinction that makes her different from most. We'll touch on that later. For now, we'll start where Cumberland's story began. When the ship was laid down on October 18th, 1924, by Vickers Armstrong, one of the first county-class cruisers, which makes her survival all the more impressive. Her construction, on the other hand, was firmly average. Cumberland would launch on March 16, 1926, and commission on February 23, 1928, a bit over 3 years after her construction began. For the mid-1920s, a time of general peace, this isn't surprising. There was no need to rush the ship. That peacetime vibe continued into Cumberland's early service. For the interwar period, the cruiser had very little of note. Not because she didn't serve well, of course, but because there just wasn't much for her to actually do. We'll touch on that after a short detour to design, which can begin with her class. As I mentioned, Cumberland was one of the first county-class cruisers, specifically one of the Kent class. There were 3 distinct subclasses here: Kent, London, and Norfolk, with York and Exeter as a related development. I should probably do a dedicated county-class video at some point in the future. For now, let's focus on Cumberland, beginning naturally with the displacement, around 9,900 tons at the standard loading. This is important because these were treaty cruisers. That meant a standard displacement limit of 10,000 tons, which the British managed to come under, although barely. The full loading, meanwhile, rose up to around 13,800 tons. On that displacement, the ships carried 8 8-inch 203mm guns in 4 twin turrets, the classic layout of 2 superfiring on the bow and 2 on the stern. These were supported by 4 4-inch guns for anti-aircraft defense. Those weapons were carried in single mounts around the third funnel, with 2 on either side of the ship. To further support those, the cruiser also carried 4 single 2-pounder anti-aircraft guns. To round off the weaponry, at least in the original design, were 2 quadruple torpedo mounts, coming out to 8 tubes, with the mounts carried on the deck just aft of the third funnel. Which brings us to the armor. As designed, this was an armored box over the magazines, reaching 4 inches at the thickest, but leaving the rest of the ship, machinery included, very vulnerable to damage. We'll return to that later. For now, let's look at speed. This was on the lower end, even for the time. 31.5 knots on around 80,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts. Not particularly slow, but cruisers in other navies were averaging 32.5 to as high as 35 knots. In any case, though, that rounds off the design. Now we can return to service history, at least for a moment. As said earlier, this began on February 23, 1928, which was mostly spent on long-distance duty. From 1928 through to the end of the 1930s, Cumberland served on the China Station. While this shows how important that area was to the British, there wasn't much action. Cumberland would have shown the flag and patrolled the general area. And things would have gotten more exciting when Japan declared war on China in 1937. But Cumberland didn't see any action. As a result, the most notable event in the 1930s didn't even come from China. Instead, it came in a major overhaul in 1935. I'll briefly summarize the important parts. First and foremost, the British went back and increased the armor protection. They used every bit of spare tonnage available to improve things where they could, notably including a proper armor belt. A belt that was either 4 or 4.5 inches thick, depending on the source. This was placed amidships, where the cruiser previously lacked any armor protection. The other notable change structurally was the fitting of a massive hangar on the stern. This supported a catapult mounted just behind the funnels, and allowed the cruiser to carry a couple walrus floatplanes. This was matched by a cut down on the stern deck that began just aft of the last turret. It's very notable comparing the ship before and after the refit. Past this, the changes were largely focused on the weaponry. The single 2-pounders were replaced by 2 quadruple 40mm pom-poms. The torpedo tubes were removed outright, and the cruiser gained 2 twin mounts for newer 4-inch guns. New weaponry past this point was rounded off by depth charges on the cut-down stern. Right, that concludes the rebuild. When that was complete, Cumberland returned to China, where she remained until 1938, at which point the cruiser shifted to the South American station. Not much would change at first. It was still peacetime and still a quiet posting. That changed, of course, in 1939. When war broke out in September, Cumberland was still in the South Atlantic. However, she was not in South America. Instead, the cruiser was at Freetown in West Africa. She would be based out of that port for most of the remaining year. As part of Force G, the cruiser was assigned to hunt for German raiders. The most notable one at this point being Admiral Graf Spee. However, Cumberland would not catch that ship. She would hunt up and down the South Atlantic from September through December. Despite sightings of Graf Spee by aircraft or from radio transmissions, nothing came from it. Although there was a close call on September 11th. One of Graf Spee's aircraft spotted Cumberland, allowing the German cruiser and the supply ship Altmark to evade the British. Otherwise, Cumberland continued to search out of Freetown, but it wouldn't be until December that things changed. Although even then, Cumberland missed the main action. Her only direct contribution would come in helping sink a German liner, Usukuma. After this, the cruiser sailed to the Falklands, where Cumberland would go in for self-refit on December 12, 1939. In other words, the cruiser moored at Port Stanley, where the crew set about fixing things up. This primarily focused on cleaning the boilers after a long period at sea. The notable thing here is that it meant she missed the Battle of the River Plate on December 13th. To the credit of her crew, Cumberland was at least quick to respond. When orders arrived to sail north, the cruiser set sail immediately. By the end of December 14th, Cumberland had arrived off the River Plate. The cruiser had sailed at an average speed of 30 knots to arrive there so quickly. Once in position, Cumberland took up patrol duty with Ajax and Achilles. She replaced Exeter as the heavy cruiser, although there would be no chance to engage the Germans, namely because the Germans scuttled their ship on December 17th, thus freeing Cumberland for more patrol duty, at least at first. This would prove short-lived. As 1939 ended and 1940 began, Cumberland would be in refit. The cruiser sailed to Simonstown, South Africa, arriving on January 11th. Where Cumberland would remain in refit until February 13th, 1940. However, not much would change. 1940 followed the pattern of 1939 for the most part. Cumberland spent the majority of the year on patrol duty in the South Atlantic, with only a couple exceptions. The first being a convoy escort run, taking her back to Britain from May 31st to June 16th, followed by a second escort on June 29th, this time to Ceylon. In the end, there would be little of note during this run. Cumberland detached from the convoy in Ceylon to return to the South Atlantic, her main target at this point being an auxiliary cruiser named Thor, which Cumberland never did succeed in catching. Instead, her next moment of excitement came in shore bombardment. During September 1940, she supported operations off Dakar. This involved attempts to catch Vichy French cruisers from September 14th through September 18th. Cumberland failed in this role, although the French cruisers were eventually forced back to port. As for Cumberland, she helped bombard the area on September 23, 1940. This would see the cruiser hit by a 9.4-inch shell from a shore battery. The damage was fairly minor, mostly consisting of a busted steam pipe and loss of power. The overall operation ended up a costly failure, while Cumberland returned to her old base at Freetown, where for the rest of the year she continued the previous duty, hunting for German raiders in the form of the elusive Thor and Admiral Scheer. Once again, this came to nothing. In any case, as 1940 moved into 1941, Cumberland continued her South Atlantic duties, at least at first. This came to an end, however, in May. The cruiser returned to Britain, arriving on June 26, 1941. She would go in for a refit, mostly to improve her anti-aircraft battery and fit radar. This concluded in September, with the post-refit trials wrapping up in October, at which point Cumberland joined the home fleet for convoy defense through to 1942, a role she would actually continue for most of the midpoint of the war. Because, as 1942 began, Cumberland would escort the Arctic convoys. That role would be her primary duty through to the end of 1943, although there would be breaks, of course, such as supporting the landings at Spitsbergen in September 1942, or covering Operation Torch by patrolling the Azores in November of the same year. As a result, Cumberland would have a pretty quiet couple years. This would continue, for the most part, to the end of the war, except with a change in locale. In January 1944, the cruiser shifted to the Indian Ocean, arriving in Ceylon in March 1944. Once there, she took up escort duty for the Eastern Fleet. At around the same time, USS Saratoga joined up for raids on Japanese holdings. For Cumberland, not much happened. She spent most of the year escorting the carriers around, with two notable events. First, shore bombardment of Sumatra on July 25th, then further bombardment of the Nicobar Islands on October 17th, during which the cruiser was attacked, unsuccessfully, by Japanese torpedo bombers. Not much to note beyond that. Cumberland would depart for a refit in South Africa in December 1944, a refit that lasted into February of 1945. When that was done, Cumberland returned to the Eastern Fleet, for basically the same role as before. I'm sure you're seeing a pattern at this point. Regardless, the cruiser would spend the rest of 1945 on escort duty, sprinkled here and there with more shore bombardment, from the Andaman Islands to the East Indies. By this point, the Japanese weren't really able to contest these actions, so Cumberland didn't see any damage of note. She just continued right along until the war came to an end in August 1945, at which point the cruiser would take up support duty, such as ferrying troops around or helping bring relief supplies to the areas that needed them. Notably, the cruiser also played host to Japanese representatives during the handover of Java. However, there was little else to do, so by June 1946, Cumberland was back in Britain, where she would be placed in reserve until 1949, in the General Naval Drawdown. Her story probably would have ended here, actually, if the British hadn't pulled her out in 1949 for a massive overhaul. Cumberland lost her 8-inch guns in favor of various experimental systems, including a test model of the dual 6-inch turret that would later end up on the Tiger-class cruiser, and on a similar note, the dual 3-inch mount for the same ships. From 1951, when the refit concluded, until 1958, Cumberland operated on this test roll. Valuable, if not particularly dramatic, work. Certainly a good way to end off her career, even without one final note. Cumberland would join a rather exclusive club in 1956. She played herself for the film The Battle of the River Plate, even though the cruiser had lattice masts and lacked her original main battery. It still remains a fairly rare distinction. However, Cumberland wouldn't last forever. She was sold for scrapping on November 3rd, 1958, bringing an end to a quiet but very useful career. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.